Welcome back everyone to another nunchuck lesson. As you probably guessed from the title of this one, we're going to be covering how to move with the downward figure 8 hand roll as well as the upward figure 8 hand roll. Okay, now I'm assuming in this lesson you know how to do each of those moves, so I'm not going to be covering how to do those here. I'm just going to be showing you how to combine those two moves in order to move with the chucks. Now I kind of touched on this in one of my previous videos, which was the alternating figure 8s video. Okay, how the turning of the body as well as how to move with it. Okay, so that's essentially what this video is going to be. It's just going to be using the hand rolls this time. Okay, there are 4 main transitions I'm going to be covering. The first 2 of which are opposite hand roll transitions, meaning they go from either a downward hand roll to an upward hand roll or vice versa. And the last 2 are a like transition, which I'll get into in a little bit. Before I get into those though, there are a couple concepts I want to go over. The first of which is there are 2 ways to switch the directions the chucks are moving in. And I've already touched on one of those in my first video, which was bouncing, if you remember that. Okay? So anytime you bounce the chucks off a part of your body, you're reversing the momentum of the chucks. Okay? So if I'm doing a downward figure 8, let's say, okay, and I want to get into the upward figure 8, I would bounce off my arm in order to do that. So as you can see, I've gone from a downward wield to an upward wield. Likewise, if I bounce again, I'm now back into the downward wield. Okay, so bouncing is one way to switch the direction of the chucks. The second way is by moving. Now moving can either consist of just turning the body like this, as I did in the figure 8s video, or movement can be taking a step one way or the other. Okay. Now the first way, the bouncing, you're changing the direction the chucks are moving by changing their momentum or reversing their momentum. So as I showed you, if I'm doing the downward figure 8 and I bounce off my arm, I've changed the direction the chucks are moving by changing their momentum. Okay. The second way, when moving, you're not changing the momentum of the chucks, you're changing their orientation. Okay. So if I'm doing an upward figure 8, if you look closely, this is actually a downward figure 8. And that may be a weird sentence to say, but imagine I was standing on the opposite side of these chucks. I'd be doing a downward figure 8, wouldn't I? Likewise, if I'm doing a downward figure 8, from my perspective and from your perspective, I'm doing a downward figure 8. If I was on the opposite side, I'd be doing an upward figure 8. Okay, so the move really depends on your orientation when moving, okay, if that makes sense. So the first way, I was changing the momentum of the chucks by reversing it with that bounce. When moving, I'm changing my orientation to the chucks. Okay, so that's the first concept. Those are the 2 main ways that you can change direction with the chucks. The second concept is how to apply those. Now anytime you do a bounce or any kind of movement, either turning the body or stepping, you're going from one hand roll into its opposite hand roll. Okay? So again, as you saw, if I'm doing a downward figure 8 hand roll and I do a bounce, now I'm in the upward hand roll. Okay? That was just bouncing. I can also move. So it's, again, I'm doing the downward figure 8 hand roll. Okay. That time I moved. There was no bounce involved. I just took a step And that took the chucks from a downward hand roll to an upward hand roll, okay? So the first part of that is anytime you do a bounce or any kind of movement, you're taking the chucks from one hand roll into its opposite hand roll. If you do both at the same time, meaning a bounce and a movement, you're taking it from one hand roll into the same hand roll. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So, like I said, the first two transitions are opposite hand rolls, so I'll get into that first. Now, the way we're going to start, I'm right-handed, so I'm going to be starting towards my right side. If you're left-handed, you'd start towards your left side. And we're going to start in downward figure 8 hand roll. And again, I'm assuming you already know how to do both of these hand rolls, so I'm not going to cover that here. So, downward figure 8 hand roll to your side. Now, if you can see here, I'm doing a hand roll to my front and a hand roll to my back. So, front hand roll, back hand roll. And I like to do that little advanced flip thing. You don't have to do that. This works in either version. Now, as I come into that front hand roll, this one here, where you go into reverse grip, as soon as I do that hand roll, I'm going to turn my torso. So this way I'm facing towards my right. As I go into that hand roll, I'm turning my torso towards my left side. And because of that, that allows me to go into the upward hand roll on this side. Okay. So, downward hand roll. And then as I come into that front hand roll, as I do that, I turn my torso the opposite way. Okay? So, as you can see there, as I go into that front hand roll, this bottom one is going to be swinging underneath towards 6 o'clock. As it does that, when I turn my body, I'm taking that momentum into the upward hand roll on this side. So all together, hand roll, turn, here's my upward. Okay? So that's the first transition. You're just taking the downward hand roll and transitioning it across in front of you into the upward hand roll on your opposite side. Like that. Okay? And because there's no bounce here, I'm just turning the body. That's taking it from one hand roll into the opposite hand roll. Okay? So that's the first transition, is from a downward to an upward. The second one, as you can imagine, is going to be from the upward back to the downward. One more thing I will say with the first transition. Here I'm just turning my torso. You can also step with that move. So as I come to that front hand roll, I can actually take a step behind with my left leg. Okay, and what that does is it actually puts the upward hand roll in the same orientation to my body as the downward was. So if you can see here, the downward hand roll is on my right side, and if I step, I'm still doing that upward hand roll, but now the upward hand roll is to my right side as well, as opposed to just turning the body where it would end up on my left side. Okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. So that would be actually moving with that move. The second one, as I said, is going from the upward hand roll to the downward hand roll. So if I go from the downward to the upward, you're going to transition the exact same way as you come into that front hand roll. Because you can see I'm doing a hand roll to my back and to my front again with the upward. Okay, so this would be to my front, this would be to my back. As I come into that front hand roll, again, I'm turning my body the opposite way towards my right. So as I go into that hand roll, turn. Now here, once you come into that front hand roll, this handle is going to be swinging this way now. So in order to take it back to the downward hand roll, you're going to bring it towards 12 o'clock back to this side. So all together, hand roll, hand roll, hand roll switch, and then this is coming to my back to that hand roll, okay? So downward, upward, and then downward again, okay? You can also step with this transition as well. So for instance, if I switch by stepping with the first transition, I can do the same thing again with that transition. Okay, so those are the first two transitions, again going from one hand roll into its opposite hand roll, going from the downward into the upward, and then back again. Oops. Okay, so those are those two hand rolls, and like I said, I'm not bouncing off any part of my body in those hand rolls, I'm just moving with it. If I wanted to just bounce, then all of those transitions happen on the same side of my body, okay? So I'm not actually moving with it. So because of that, it's going from one into the other. Now, the next one, the third transition, is going from a downward hand roll into another downward hand roll. And to do that, like I said, you have to combine a bounce as well as a movement, okay? So again, I'm starting to my right side in the downward hand roll. Oops. Now, this time the transition is actually going to happen towards my back. So that hand roll. Now as I come out of that back hand roll, okay, you can see this other handle is swinging downwards. And if I extend my arm out, that's a perfect time to do a bounce, okay? So hand roll, bounce. Now after I do that bounce, what I'm doing is I'm taking my back leg and stepping through, and once I've bounced, I've switched the momentum. I'll actually try it from this side. So downward, bounce. Once that bounce happens, I'm into an upward wheel. But if I combine that with a step, that takes it back into a downward wheel. And what that looks like is that, okay? So all I'm doing there is when I do that back hand roll, this one here, as soon as I come out of that, and this handle is coming over, I'm bouncing off my underarm while stepping through, and then I'm bringing this back into a downward hand roll on this side. So hand roll, bounce, turn, hand roll. Okay, so that's what that one looks like. Now that's stepping through in front of me. I can also step back behind me as well by doing this move and transition that way. Now to do it that way, I'm not actually doing a hand roll to transition. What I'm doing there is, instead of going into that front hand roll, that one there, all I'm doing here is, as I'm stepping back, I'm just bringing this into a shoulder bounce, which would look like that. And then from there, I can go into the hand roll on this side. So the first version, I'm bouncing, stepping through, and then bringing it over to this side for the downward. In the other version, I'm taking out the hand roll in front of me and just stepping back, bounce off my arm, and going into the hand roll. So a little bit faster. The difference between those two okay, that's the first version. That's the second version. Okay. So that's how you go from a downward hand roll to a downward hand roll. Okay. Now the last one, again, as you can imagine, is going from an upward hand roll to an upward hand roll. And again, like I said, you have to do a movement combined with a bounce. Now this time, I'm going to start with an upward hand roll to my right, okay? Got nose itch. Now again, this transition is going to happen in front of me as I go into that front hand roll. That would be the back hand roll, that would be the front hand roll. And if you watch, as I go into that hand roll, that was sloppy. As I go into that front hand roll, this handle is going to be coming over the top towards 12 o'clock. Okay, as you saw it there. As it does that, I'm extending my arm out and letting it bounce underneath again. Okay, as I step. And what that does is it reverses the momentum back into an upward figure eight. So really I could do the same movement just turning my body, because turning the body counts as a movement. Okay, so upward, upward. As I come to that front hand roll, bounce, and that puts me back into the upward hand roll. So a little bit faster. Okay, that's what that would look like. I can also move with that as well by taking a step. Okay, so upward bounce step, upward bounce, bounce, bounce. Okay, so again, you can step with that one, you know, back and forth, back and forth. You can turn, step back, turn, step back. So those are the ways to actually move with the chucks. Now, let me make sure you can actually see this. I'm going to see if I can do a series of these for you. Back up a bit. Okay, hopefully you'll be able to see this. I'm going to do a series of these for you back and forth. Caught up here. Alright, so let me move this back. So hopefully you can see what I was doing there. All I was doing was combining that the backwards downward transition, that one there, and then bouncing, going into the upward, and then going the opposite direction. Okay, and then back and forth, back and forth. Hey, sorry the video got cut off. My camera, I guess, overheated and shut off on me. So the only thing I was going to say in that last bit of the video was the important things to remember are anytime you bounce or you move, you're going from one hand roll into its opposite hand roll, and anytime you combine a bounce with a movement, you're going from one hand roll into the same hand roll. And one thing I would recommend practicing is just focus on one side of your body, just doing a bounce. So start in a downward figure eight hand roll, bounce, and go into the upward hand roll, bounce again, down, up, down, etc. And that'll really help you for when you're actually moving with the hand rolls themselves, okay? So that'll really train you for when you're actually moving. So that's a good way to practice. Just focus on one side of your body and just work on bouncing between one and the other. And then that'll help you with your transitions as you're moving back and forth, okay? That's that video. Again, it's not too difficult. It's just combining two moves you already know with either moving or bouncing, okay? In the next video, I'm going to be covering something called riffs, which is those things there. That's a fun one because you're actually doing stuff on your frontal plane. And a lot of the stuff I've covered has actually been either to your sides or horizontal stuff. So this will actually be a frontal thing, okay? So I will see you in that video. Thanks for watching.